What happens when power no longer wants to rule, but to be loved, dressed, adored, and obeyed in the shape of a god? Picture yourself standing in the Forum of ancient Rome at twilight. The marble stones beneath your feet are warm from the day's sun, and the city smells of incense, sweats, and something metallic, maybe blood. Trumpets ring out not to declare war, but to begin a wedding. It is not a wedding between two citizens, not even between two gods. It is a wedding between one boy and the empire itself, between a human body and the idea of worship, and everyone must attend. He arrives not on horseback or chariot, but beneath a canopy of silk carried by 4 eunuchs in golden robes. His face is powdered, his lips are painted. Around his neck hangs a medallion of the Syrian sun god, Elagabalus, and Rome is silent, because this is no ordinary groom. This is Elagabalus, emperor of the known world, 14 years old, wearing the wedding dress of a goddess.
You might ask, why? Why would a Roman emperor call himself the bride of a foreign god? Why force Rome to watch? Why turn a continent-spanning empire into a stage for his personal devotion? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you think. Because he could. Because at some point love becomes command, devotion becomes theatre, and a lonely boy becomes a mirror, reflecting back to the world not who he is, but who he desperately needs to be. This is not a story of madness. It is a story of longing, twisted, ceremonial, and uncontainable. A story about what happens when a crown is placed not on the head of a ruler, but on the heart of a child who never wanted to rule, only to be seen. This story is heavy, not in battles or armies, but in the weight of performance, the weight of trying to hold an empire's gaze and whisper, "Please love me back." What you're about to hear is not about Elagabalus alone.
It's about us, about power, identity, and the ancient and dangerously modern desire to make the whole world applaud your reflection. To understand the strange reign of Elagabalus, we must first look beyond the marble palaces of Rome and into the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. Here, in the city of Emesa, modern-day Homs, was born a boy who would one day become the most enigmatic emperor in Roman history. His name was Varius Evitus Bassianus, but history would remember him as Elagabalus, after the god he served. From a young age, Bassianus was immersed in the rituals of the cult of Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, whose fiery image dominated the city's grand temple. Unlike the distant Olympian gods of Rome, Elagabal was a living presence, felt in the heat of the sun, heard in the rhythm of drums, and seen in the golden rays that bathed the desert. Bassianus was no ordinary child. Groomed by priests and priestess alone, he was taught the sacred rites, the secret chants, and the elaborate ceremonies that honored his deity. He wore the high priest's robes, heavy with embroidered gold and purple silk. His days were filled with ritual, his nights with whispered prayers to a god who demanded complete devotion. But this boy's destiny was caught between worlds. While his home lay in Syria, his fate was tied to Rome, the heart of an empire built on discipline, order, and military might. Bassianus's family was no stranger to power. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, was a shrewd political player who wielded influence behind the scenes in the chaotic corridors of Roman politics.
When the empire spiraled into turmoil and the throne was left vulnerable, Maesa saw her chance. Her grandson, the Sun Priest, would become the instrument of her ambition. At only 14 years old, Bassianus was paraded into Rome not as a boy, but as a living incarnation of Elagabalus. The legions and senators were introduced to a figure so foreign and bewildering that many questioned if he was even human. Yet the young priest embraced his role with eerie conviction. The imperial purple was draped over his shoulders, and the golden diadem pressed against his brow. He declared himself not merely emperor, but the god-bride of Elagabalus, the living manifestation of divine power. This was a new kind of rule, one not based on laws or senate decrees, but on ritual and spectacle. To Elagabalus, the distinction between self and God blurred. His identity was inseparable from his divine role, and the emperor's personal desires became indistinguishable from religious obligation. He insisted on replacing the old Roman gods with Elagabalus as the supreme deity. Temples were transformed, statues torn down, and ancient rites discarded. Rome, the cradle of empire and tradition, was forced to kneel before a foreign sun god, whose bride was a teenage boy, dressed as a goddess. The empire trembled on the edge of disbelief and awe.
Elagabalus was not simply a ruler. He was a cosmic performance, an emperor who wore makeup, appointed male lovers as consorts, and demanded that his court celebrate his rituals as if they were the destiny of Rome itself. Yet beneath the lavish ceremonies and eccentric displays lay a young man struggling to claim an identity that neither Rome nor Syria fully understood. Imagine the grand hall of the Palatine Hill Palace, illuminated by thousands of oil lamps, whose flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the frescoed walls. The air is thick with incense, mingling with the murmurs of Rome's elite, all dressed in their finest silks and jewels. Tonight is a wedding unlike any Rome has ever witnessed. Elagabalus, the boy emperor, stands at the center, clad in the richest purple robes embroidered with gold thread. His face is carefully powdered, his lips a subtle shade of crimson. Around his neck rests the sacred solemn medallion of Elagabalus. But what captivates and horrifies the crowd is the bride beside him, a young man dressed as a woman, adorned with jewels that once belonged to the emperor's late mother. This is not mere spectacle. It is the embodiment of the emperor's obsession to resurrect the lost love of his life through ritual and flesh. This bride is not a willing participant, but a carefully chosen replica, a living effigy of the deceased, reshaped by imperial decree. The young man's body has been altered through painful and irreversible means to resemble the woman Elagabalus once mourned. The surgery was brutal, an act of violence veiled in language of devotion. The boy who once had dreams and a name now carries only the weight of a role forced upon him.
The guests see a bride, but the truth is a haunting tableau of loss, possession, and denial. The ceremony unfolds with a mixture of ancient Syrian rites and Roman pomp. Priests chant hymns in a language foreign to the Roman tongue. The sun god's presence is invoked with fiery offerings and sacred dances that echo through the marble halls. Elagabalus takes his vows not just as emperor, but as the bride, the god's earthly vessel. His voice, soft and melodious, commands the court's unwavering attention. But beneath the ritual's grandeur lies a terrifying truth: the emperor's desire to erase death, to rewrite fate itself. The court's participation is compulsory. Senators, generals, and nobles smile through clenched jaws, raising their goblets in hollow toasts. Each knows that resistance means exile, or worse. Outside, Rome whispers. The empire is divided between awe, disbelief, and fear. The emperor has transformed himself from ruler to spectacle, demanding that the empire love the reflection of a god, and in doing so has made himself and those around him prisoners of a grand illusion. Elagabalus's obsession extends beyond ceremony. He surrounds himself with lovers and favorites, appointing men to roles traditionally held by women, blurring gender and power with reckless abandon.
The young emperor rejects the old order, dismantling centuries of tradition in favor of his personal vision, one where the lines between deity, monarch, and child dissolve into a painful ambiguity. His actions provoke fury and scandal, yet also reveal the desperate yearning of a boy who, lost between worlds, seeks to be loved not as a ruler, but as someone truly seen. This wedding, this act of divine defiance, marks both the zenith and the beginning of the unraveling. The grand hall of the imperial palace was filled with the brightest and most powerful of Rome, senators in their togas, generals polished in armor, patricians adorned with jewels stolen from the furthest corners of the empire. They sat on velvet cushions, their faces masks of polite admiration, but their eyes betrayed an entirely different story. No one dared to speak openly against the emperor, but whispers slithered like serpents between columns and behind velvet curtains. Some called him a madman, others a god gone astray. Many feared consequences of dissent far more than they hated the spectacle before them. One aged senator, known for his sharp tongue but cautious discretion, recalled, "We toasted the empress with trembling hands and forced smiles, but in our hearts we mourned the empire's soul. The gods we knew were gone, replaced by shadows and mirrors." The courtiers knew that to question the emperor was to invite ruin. The imperial household was a gilded cage, but one lined with daggers, exile, imprisonment, or worse, death. Many feigned enthusiasm at the lavish festivities. They drank rich wine, nodded at the emperor's commands, and applauded the intricate dances that twisted the old religious rites into new and unrecognizable forms.
Yet beneath the surface, fear simmered. Outside the palace walls, Rome was a city caught between awe and horror. The common people whispered stories of the emperor's oddities, of his male consorts dressed as women, and his court that resembled a theatre more than a government.
Governor after governor began to murmur dissatisfaction. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's once loyal protectors, grew restless, uneasy at the chaos infecting the imperial court. The empire's foundations began to crack. For Elagabalus, the court's silence was deafening. He misread the forced smiles as adoration, the whispered fears as reverence. His world shrank to the rituals, the ceremonies, the endless performance of a role he was born to play but never fully understood. His lovers and favorites were his only companions, each more devoted than the last, but none could pierce the veil of loneliness that cloaked the emperor. In his heart, Elagabalus was not a tyrant. He was a boy lost between identity and expectation, divine role and human desire. He tried to rewrite the rules of power, to fuse religion and love into a new order. But in doing so, he alienated the very people he ruled. And when the empire's patience finally broke, the stage was set not for a glorious transformation, but for a violent and tragic end.
The sun was merciless that day. It bore down on the streets of Rome, the heat bending the air like a mirage shimmering over the Tiber. But the city was not focused on the summer's blistering breath. It was focused on the end of a reign so strange, so scandalous, it would haunt the empire's memory for centuries. Elagabalus's enemies, long waiting in the shadows, finally moved. The Praetorian Guard, those same soldiers who had once carried him on golden litters, turned their spears against the boy emperor. They stormed the palace, capturing the young ruler who had worn the mantle of god, bride, and monarch in a spectacle no one could understand. His death was brutal and swift. Dragged through the street, his body was left in the sewer, discarded like refuse. No funeral rites, no imperial honors, just silence. The Senate moved quickly to erase every trace of the boy who dared to rewrite Roman religion and identity. His statues were smashed, his name damned, and his memory consigned to damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory. Yet, like a shadow, his story persisted in whispers and fragments, growing into legend and warning. But who was Elagabalus beneath the paint and robes?
A tyrant, a madman, or a frightened child lost between worlds. He was all these and none. He was a mirror shattered, reflecting the fears and desires of an empire on the brink. His story forces us to ask what happens when identity is dictated by power, not self, when love is a command and devotion a performance. How much of ourselves do we sacrifice to wear the masks others place on us? Today, far from Rome's marble halls, we still see echoes of Elagabalus, in celebrities who live for the gaze of millions, in leaders who conflate power with personal worship, in social media profiles carefully curated to project an identity not quite their own. The desire to be seen, to be loved, to be godlike in the eyes of others remains as potent and as dangerous as it was 2,000 years ago. Elagabalus died not because he lacked power, but because he demanded a world to love a version of himself that could never be real. His death is both tragedy and lesson.
that the masks we wear, the roles we perform, can become prisons from which only silence can free us. And as you step away from this story, ask yourself, who are you beneath your own masks, and what price would you pay to be truly seen?